Hi everybody, this is Brad. This is my Recycling Constructivist Unit Plan. And here we go. So the overview that I wrote for this was the goal is for students to gain in-depth knowledge about one particular kind of recycling, and an important part of that is interest to them. So they should be researching whatever particular kind of recycling that they're interested in. The goal of that is to increase motivation by providing as much choice as possible. They're going to convey information orally and through a shared essay at the end. They should be focusing on academic language and on some fairly complex thinking. There can be some guides along the way that will help that, but the overall guiding question of the unit is, how does recycling impact our environment? They're going to have to work together, research, and develop those vocabulary skills. So the strategies, and I hope you appreciate my pictures. We've got Kelly Gallagher and Jen Cervalo working on some reading strategies, I hope, but I threw in the whole grab bag. Everything from WordWall down to Kelly Gallagher's radar revision that we do at the end. A lot of this is things that we've already talked about, and I'll talk about some of them as the lessons go on. So the academic vocabulary that I selected for this came from a list of scientific vocabulary for secondary students. The ones that I picked, I had a much bigger list and they were fairly random, but I came up with a list of academic vocabulary that seemed that they would be likely used in articles about academic vocabulary. So there was a fair amount of thinking that goes into it. So that would be the list on the left, and the list over here on the right. The unit vocabulary I got from another secondary recycling unit, and that seemed like a pretty good starting point. I didn't add anything to it, but all of those things together seem like a way on the left to talk about recycling in an academic way, and the unit vocabulary, I guess I had envisioned it as a way to read about recycling. So I've got the reading and the writing taken care of, at least as far as the vocabulary goes. The learning objectives, I've got 2 science standards, both of which relate directly to recycling. If you look at the descriptions of them, they're not really worded that way in the standards themselves, but if you look at the descriptions, they do specifically talk about recycling. So the first one is to evaluate competing design solutions, and the second one is evaluating and refining technological solutions that reduce human impact. The other 2 that I picked were a reading and a writing standard in each of in the science standards for the Wisconsin standards for literacy in all subjects. One of which is about understanding. This is, I believe this to be a vocab standard, and this one is using precise language and domain-specific vocabulary. So I made vocabulary a primary focus in writing and reading. So the intro to the unit is the first actual lesson. I thought that it was fair to do this. It seems like something that's going to need a fair amount of explanation, so I wanted to set this up in a way that would set students up for later success. The objectives were to preview the unit and give a fair description on the summative assessment so that students know what end they're working toward. And some of the goal is to activate background knowledge. The literacy strategies I use are an admission ticket and an anticipation guide. And then in previewing the summative, I inform students that they need to use a composition notebook for column notes. It could be one way or the other. I actually like composition notebooks, but I know not every teacher uses them. So the teacher would have to provide that resource if the students didn't use composition notebooks. The recycling anticipation guide is something that would have to be done as well. And I like admission tickets as Google Forms because you can collect and quantify the data, and students need Chromebooks to do most of this. So to begin the unit off, I'd simply ask the question, how can we as citizens in a local community reduce our impact on the environment and do our best to manage resources? I tied that directly to the standards so that we could work toward one common idea. And that's the same question in so many words that the students are going to be answering once they put together their shared essays. So students get a preview. They complete the anticipation guide on recycling, and I like to do anticipation guides followed up with a north, south, east, west discussion just to get them talking. And then to meet the constructivist unit criteria, I turn that into a whole class discussion either during or end, and then doing all of those constructivist discussion techniques that good constructivist teachers do. Okay, lesson 2 actually takes us to the La Crosse County landfill. This is the video that they watch over here. I included it in the presentation because it looked like to me that the rubric required some kind of pictures and videos. I'm not going to show that here because that would take too long. But the objectives were for students to learn and understand what the landfill does, so that they have some idea when they get there what they're looking for. And they're going to read an article or series of articles which are on the La Crosse County landfill webpage, and that's going to build some background knowledge and hopefully get them curious about the topic and get their minds working once they get there. The formative assessments, there's a think, pair, share feedback form that I developed. There's an exit ticket, and I will give them column feedback on their column notes, which is their first stab at it. So then I'll know that they're doing the column notes correctly going forward, because they're a big part of their learning for the entire unit. So they, at the end, and I'll talk about that later, they transfer their column notes to an outline, and then they turn the outline into the essay. So there's the video, and then there's the turn and talk. Day 1 begins with some journal taking and some quick writes. And this is where the teacher needs to do some modeling on column notes over on the DocCam with this article right here. And students are going to provide answers as we hand them off on the gradual release of responsibility. Day 2 of the second lesson, students get grouped into threes, and then they actually tackle those 3 articles on the La Crosse County website that I talked about. They make some predictions, and in their journals, they're going to be looking to examine and classify various types of recycled materials. I put that in for the constructivist part, but that's what they do on day 3 when they're actually at the field trip. Some of the the housekeeping stuff of organizing them and telling them, what good citizenship on a field trip looks like gets handled, but I left it off for the sake of brevity. Lesson 3 is kind of, I think, the core of this. At least for the instruction part, but it's still constructivist because students construct a lot of the learning themselves, and most of how I planned the vocabulary in this lesson is kind of how I've begun to handle it in my class, thanks to taking this reading coursework. So these are the objectives. The formative assessments, there's a KIM strategy, which if you do a Google search for, you will get plenty of examples. There's a Quizlet Live and a low-stakes vocabulary quiz that will help the teacher determine if additional instruction is required, and you'll see how there's plenty of opportunities for expansion once we move on. So students begin by copying the word wall words into their notebooks, and I model initially how to create vocabulary entries, which kind of follows a Marzano approach with all of the Marzano elements. They work with an elbow partner, and then they do their own research to determine what the descriptions for these words are, their own connections, etc., drawing their symbols. I had in my lesson plan the actual 6 steps right here, and I broke them down for any teacher who might want to use this as to what you could do for each of the strategies, including a big list for step 4, step 5, and a couple down for step 6. I put these 2 in bold, actually these 3 KIM strategy over here, because these are things that I typically do, and if I were teaching this unit, I wouldn't have to model very much because my kids are pretty well into it. I like to use a lot of these things because I like to mix things up because I think kids get bored. But then last week I said, okay, we're going to try something different. We're going to do word frames instead of a KIM strategy. And their consensus was, sorry for the lawnmower in the background. No, I apologize. That's a street sweeper. But their opinion was, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So if you find one thing that works and the kids aren't bored, use that. Lesson 4 is their actual article reading and the inquiry circle part of it, where they follow their area of interest. The teacher will have grouped them by area of interest. The opportunities for formative feedback are in column note feedback and their article approval and feedback on the article. To make sure they're going to write the essay correctly, the teacher has to make sure that they're getting the right types of information from the right articles. The actual process, to sort them, I would do a Google form. I think that's easy, where you give them 3 choices, then you get a little bit of play as to who works with whom, and you know that you can put together good groups. The teacher has to do a fair amount of modeling for any of this, especially if you want success. Students begin their research on their topics, and I thought the goal should be about 10 articles on the topic. I need to keep cruising, or I'm going to run out of time. Putting it all together, writing the shared essay. The teacher does need to do some modeling, but this is where the students put together what they learned. So the teacher should be providing formative feedback on their outline and on their early written drafts. The actual process I broke down here into teacher will and student will statements. Teacher needs to explain the requirements. Students are going to work together in groups to complete the shared essay outline. So they go from outline to draft. I use Gallagher's radar revision process so that the drafts are nice and shiny. And some differentiation, I added this part on here because I thought that it's important. Students can be provided with additional supports like sentence frames if necessary. Some may need extra writing support, which the teacher may provide, and a slide template for students who require additional support for the slide presentation. The reason I put jigsaw at the beginning was because this whole thing functions as a jigsaw. The students jigsaw an essay more or less by doing a shared essay, and then by presenting on their various topics, the students jigsaw the entire topic of recycling for the entire class. Additional parts of that could be added later. They go well beyond the scope and the time frame for this essay. I hope I explained this pretty well, and I'm almost at 11 minutes, so I'm going to stop talking now.